At some point in every man's life, everything he thought was solid begins to shift. That moment came for me too. My name is Daniel Foster. I'm 48 years old and live in Fort Worth, Texas. I've worked as a senior operations engineer at a regional energy provider for 21 years. Stable job, good coworkers, and a decent benefits package. My wife, Kelly, is 45. We've been married for almost 2 decades. We have 2 kids. Our son is 17, our daughter is 14. We live in a brick ranch house in Wedgwood, on the southwest edge of town, the kind with a 2-car garage, a swing set that hasn't been used in years, and a lawn I still mow myself. I bought the place back in 2008. Rates were brutal. Didn't matter, I closed it alone, just like I do everything else. It was Monday, February 6:42 a.m. The air outside was crisp, mid-40s. I was standing at the kitchen window, drinking black coffee from my old Texas Tech mug. The ceramic's chipped, but I like it that way. Our golden retriever, Toby, was making slow loops around the backyard, nose to the ground. Inside, the house felt quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The loaded kind. Like a silence waiting to be broken. The shift had been slow. Kelly started working later. Team deadlines, she said. Some Friday nights she came home with Boston Market takeout instead of cooking like she used to. She made a great meatloaf once. Her phone, once left on the charger overnight, now followed her everywhere. Shower, laundry room, even into the garage. One day I saw the lock screen change. New code. She didn't say anything. I didn't lose my temper. I just paid attention. A week ago, I pulled into the Albertsons off Hullen. She said she needed eggs. I saw her parked near the side, still in her car, laughing at something on her phone. Not texting, FaceTiming. I watched for 30 seconds from behind a Jeep Grand Cherokee. She never saw me. She smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. Every weekday I leave the house at 7:20 a.m. drive east down Granbury, cut up Trail Lake to I-20. I listen to Kara News, then flip to KRLD for market updates. My office is on the 12th floor downtown. I sign off on site evaluations and outage reviews. What I do matters, at least it used to feel like it. But at home, I began to feel like furniture. We shared a bed, sure, but we might as well have been strangers at a bus stop. She curled toward the far wall, always asleep before I got in. Dinner talk was limited to how the kids were doing, whether Emma needed new cleats or if Ben had checked in with the college counselor. The rest, silence. Once, around 11 p.m., I heard her on the back porch whispering. It was cold outside, but she stayed there 15 minutes. The heater kicked on. She didn't come back to bed right away. I kept all this to myself. Then Sunday morning at 9:03 sharp, because I checked, she set a cup of coffee down in front of me and said, "Dan, can we have lunch tomorrow? I made a reservation. Just us. There's something I'd like to talk about." No expression. No nervousness. Just precision. Like confirming a dentist appointment. I said, "Sure." She nodded, then left the kitchen. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at the desk in our bedroom and looked over our shared calendar. I noticed a block day on the previous weekend, labeled Training Weekend, Austin. I remembered asking her about it. She'd said it was for a regional sales seminar. Funny thing was, the firm she works for doesn't cover hotels for Saturday overnights unless it's a trade show. I looked up her hotel booking history. Nothing under her rewards account. Then I stopped myself. I wasn't going to be that guy. Not yet. Monday came. I left the office at 11:47 a.m. Lunch was at Blue Mesa off University Drive, a place we used to go before we had kids. That's where I proposed, actually. Funny what gets recycled. I pulled into the lot at 11:58. Clear sky. 52 degrees. The patio was empty except for one couple sipping iced tea. I walked past them and stepped inside. The hostess looked up. "Table for 2?" she asked. "No," I said. "Someone's waiting for me." She nodded, pointed to a window booth. And there she was. She was already seated. Alone, I thought, until I noticed the second jacket draped over the back of the booth. That jacket didn't belong to me. And that was the moment everything began to crystallize. He was sitting just a little too close to her. That was the first thing I noticed. They weren't touching, no hands held, no leaning in, but there was no professional space between them either. There's a geometry people hold when they've crossed a line. And they had. I stopped 2 steps from the table. Kelly looked up and smiled faintly. He turned when he heard my steps, met my eyes, and didn't look away. His face was calm. Confident. Gray jacket. Not off the rack. Watch, expensive. I took it all in as if time had slowed. I said, "Hey." She said, "Hey. This is Tom. We work together in Austin." He said, "Nice to meet you, Dan." I answered, "Sure." Likewise. I sat across from him, not her. I didn't touch the menu. I hadn't come to eat. I'd come to see. They hesitated. The silence sat between us. Finally she said, "We didn't want it to happen like this." I said, "But it did." He nodded. A little too smoothly. That's when I knew, this wasn't new. This wasn't last week. This had been planned, discussed, rehearsed. He wasn't nervous. He was sure. I didn't ask questions. I had answers. I knew about the Austin trip. I'd seen the hotel charges. I'd seen the photos. There was no need to yell. I watched, I listened, and inside I mapped out my next move. She said, "We don't want to destroy everything." I said, "That already happened. The only question now is what gets left standing." The February sun poured through the window onto the table. Bright, flat. Like an interrogation room. He looked at me, not smug, not ashamed. Just calculating. Like a man who thinks he's already won. But I knew something he didn't. The game isn't over until one of you stands up and walks away. We sat for 8 minutes. I kept count. No server approached our table. Maybe they sensed it. Or maybe Kelly had warned them. When I finally stood, I didn't say goodbye. I didn't give them permission. I just left. I stepped outside. The air had warmed up to 54 degrees. A light breeze. I looked out at the parking lot. There was my truck, same spot. Nothing had moved. Except me. As I walked back to my truck, I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. And clarity is a dangerous thing, especially when you realize you have nothing left to lose, but everything left to reclaim. That same afternoon, I didn't go back to the office. I drove. No destination, just movement. West on I-30. Then south on 820. I didn't listen to the radio. I kept the windows up. My hands at 10 and 2. At 1:15 p.m., I pulled into a gas station near Benbrook Lake. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes with the engine running. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text. I just watched a mother wipe her toddler's face with a napkin from a fast food bag in the front seat of a Toyota Corolla. And for some reason, that image felt heavier than anything else that day. I went home early. The kids were still at school. Kelly's car wasn't in the driveway. I walked into the house. Quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a while, then opened the fridge. Half a rotisserie chicken. A tub of hummus. Beer from last week's game. I didn't touch any of it. Instead, I went upstairs to my home office. There's a filing cabinet in the corner. Bottom drawer. Third folder from the back. I opened it. Inside, documents. Property deed. Life insurance. Joint accounts. Password lists. Notes I'd kept over the years, not to trap anyone, but because it's what engineers do. You record data. You make backups. I sat down and made a list. Not out of anger, but logistics. What we own. What I need to separate. What the kids will need. Who I have to speak to. I added her parents' numbers, though I hadn't called them in years. Then I folded the paper, slid it into a clean envelope, and placed it back in the drawer. By 3:50 p.m., Emma was home. She kicked off her shoes, dropped her backpack, and asked if we could go get ice cream later. I said yes. She didn't ask where Mom was. She just went to her room and turned on the Bluetooth speaker. At 5:10, Ben came in. I heard the usual thud of his backpack and the opening of the fridge. He called out, "Dinner plans?" I said, "Thinking of ordering Thai." "You good with that?" He said, "Sure. Just let me know." That evening, I ordered enough for 4 out of habit. Kelly didn't show. Her location wasn't shared anymore, I checked. I deleted the Find My app without hesitation. At 8:34 p.m., my phone buzzed. A text. "Kelly, I'll be home late. Don't wait up." No apology. No explanation. Just efficiency. Like someone sending a colleague a status update from a different time zone. I didn't reply. The next day I met with a lawyer. The firm was recommended by a colleague, someone who'd gone through something similar 2 years back. The attorney, Mitchell Harlan, looked like a man who had seen every version of my situation. His office smelled like leather and coffee. He said, "Tell me everything. No guesswork. Facts." I did. All of it. Hotel receipts. Timeline. The confrontation. No drama. Just facts. He said, "Texas is a community property state. But you've got leverage if you stay calm and move first." I said, "That's the plan." He said, "You're ahead already." He gave me instructions. Documents to gather. Accounts to freeze. Notifications to issue. Timing mattered. I had to be quiet, methodical. I agreed to all of it. That evening, Kelly came home at 11:22 p.m. I was awake, sitting in the living room with the lights off. She didn't see me at first. She said, "You're still up?" I said, "Just thinking." She didn't ask what about. She went upstairs. I stayed until I heard the water run. Then the click of the bathroom door. Then silence. The next morning, I dropped the kids at school and returned to the lawyer's office. We filed. Quietly. No public records yet. No noise. Just the legal beginning of the end. That night, as I stood alone in our garage, lights off, hands still, I realized this wasn't collapse. It was clearance. I wasn't losing my life. I was reclaiming it, inch by calculated inch. 2 days after filing, I started sleeping better. Not longer, but better. No turning over. No checking the clock. Just a heavy, quiet sleep, the kind that feels earned. At work, nothing changed, on the surface. I was still early. Still methodical. I still kept an extra white button-down shirt in my bottom drawer in case of meetings. But now, between safety reports and site estimates, I was scanning email traffic, reviewing joint account activity, and forwarding documents to Mitchell, my attorney. Quietly. Without trace. Kelly still came and went. Late nights. Cold mornings. Her tone hadn't shifted much. If anything, she was more polite. Not warm. Just streamlined. The kind of voice you use when talking to a neighbor you barely know but might need a favor from someday. On Friday, I came home to find a manila envelope on my desk. Inside were the first draft documents: property division, temporary custody agreements, proposed visitation calendar. I read it all twice. Nothing surprised me. Except the way my signature looked at the bottom. It didn't look like surrender. It looked like control. That evening, Emma asked why Mom hadn't been around much lately. I told her. "She's had some work trips. We're sorting a few things out." She said, "Is it bad?" I said, "It's not simple. But I'm here. That's not changing." She nodded. Then went back to her homework. 14-year-olds are smarter than they let on. Saturday morning, Kelly asked if we could talk. It was the first time she'd initiated a conversation since the lunch at Blue Mesa. She said, "Can we sit for a bit? Just us?" I said, "All right." We sat on the back porch. The sky was overcast. Gray light filtering through the mesh. She wore a sweatshirt I bought her years ago at a beach shop in Galveston. I noticed the sleeves were frayed. She said, "I know you filed." I said, "Yes." She said, "I wasn't expecting you to move so fast." I answered, "You planned for a while. I'm just catching up." She looked at her hands. She said, "Do the kids know?" I said, "They know something's changing. Not everything." She said, "I don't want them to hate me." I said, "That depends on what you do next." There was silence. Birds, wind, a dog barking 3 houses down. She said, "It wasn't supposed to go like this." I said, "It never is." Later that day, I took Ben to his soccer game. I cheered from the sidelines. Shook hands with other dads. Passed out water bottles. I didn't mention anything. There's a dignity in keeping the line between your private ruin and public role intact. Some men forget that. I didn't. Sunday, I visited my brother, Patrick, in Arlington. We sat on his patio, watched the Cowboys play. At halftime, he said, "So you're doing this?" I said, "Yeah. I'm doing it." He said, "You good?" I said, "Not good. But clear." He said nothing after that. Just handed me a cold beer. That was enough. Monday came. At 7:04 a.m., I received a text from Kelly. "Kelly, can we not make this ugly? Please." I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty. Just clarity. At work, I asked to be temporarily reassigned to the Frisco office. Needed new air. Less familiarity. My boss approved it without question. That evening, I boxed up some things, took only what I needed. I found an apartment north of the Loop. 2 bedrooms. Clean. Nothing fancy. Lease was short-term. That was intentional. I moved out on a Wednesday. When I told the kids, Emma cried quietly. Ben looked at the floor. I said, "This doesn't change how much I love you. Or how present I'll be." They said nothing. But they hugged me. Tight. That first night in the new place, surrounded by unopened boxes and the hum of the refrigerator, I sat in a folding chair, stared at the ceiling, and thought, not about what I'd lost, but about how, for the first time in years, I could finally hear my own thoughts. And I knew, silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's the start of something solid. The first week in the apartment passed quietly. I didn't furnish much, just a mattress on a metal frame, a folding table, 2 chairs, and a coffee machine. No television. No wall art. The silence wasn't empty. It was structured. Each morning, I drove north to the Frisco office. New faces, same work. Nobody asked questions. I wore the same press shirts, arrived 10 minutes early, and responded to emails with the same precision I always had. But internally, something had shifted. I was operating on a different current now, one grounded not in stability, but in design. On Thursday, Kelly texted, "Ben has a math test. He's nervous." I replied, "Tell him I'm free tonight if he wants help." She didn't respond. But at 7:03 p.m., my phone rang. It was Ben. He said, "Hey. Can you FaceTime? I don't get one of these questions." I answered, "Sure. Let's figure it out." We spent 35 minutes going over equations. I didn't ask about the house. Or her. Just math. The next morning, I called Mitchell, my lawyer. I said, "I want to adjust the custody proposal. More even split." He said, "That'll change negotiations." I said, "I'm not negotiating with her. I'm setting up what works for the kids." He said, "Understood." That Saturday, I met Emma at a diner near the apartment. We had waffles and bacon. She told me about a school project on state history. I listened, nodded, asked questions. Then she paused. She said, "Do you hate Mom?" I said, "No. But I don't trust her." She said, "Are you sad?" I answered, "Not sad. Just adjusting. She nodded, then asked if we could stop at Target for poster board. We did. Later that week, Kelly asked if we could meet. Neutral ground. She suggested the same diner. I arrived first. Sat in a booth. When she walked in, I noticed the strain around her eyes. Fatigue. She looked less polished than usual. She sat down without speaking. She said, "I didn't expect you to change so quickly." I said, "You expected me to fold." She said, "That's not fair." I said, "Maybe. But it's accurate." She didn't argue. Just exhaled slowly. She said, "Tom and it's not what I thought." I didn't respond. She said, "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know." I said, "All right." The check came. I paid it without discussion. As we stood to leave, she said, "You seem different." I said, "I am." That night, I walked through the apartment complex courtyard. Lights from other windows flickered across hedges. I watched a couple carry groceries into their unit. The man looked tired. The woman held the door open with her foot, balancing a gallon of milk and a child's jacket. I remembered what that was like. The rhythm of shared life. And I realized something. It wasn't what I missed. It was who I had been when it still felt real. Sunday afternoon, I got a call from Kelly. She said, "Emma wants to stay with you this week." I said, "That's fine." She paused. She said, "I think she just needs time away from me." I said, "That's not a problem." By 5:15 p.m., Emma was unpacking a bag in the second bedroom. She brought books, a blanket, and a stuffed bear she used to say she'd outgrown. I didn't comment. Just helped her make the bed. That evening, she fell asleep on the couch while we watched a documentary about the national parks. I turned the volume down and let her sleep. I stared at the screen, but my mind wasn't on Yellowstone or Yosemite. It was on the fact that slowly, brick by brick, I was building something again, not the same house, not the same version of life. But something quieter, simpler. Mine. That night, as I stood at the bedroom door and watched my daughter sleep peacefully in a home built from scratch, I felt a strange mix of grief and calm. And I knew the fire was behind me. But the ground ahead, still hot, still shifting, was mine to claim. Step by deliberate step. A week later, Emma was still at my place. She'd settled into a rhythm, homework on the kitchen table, cereal in the mornings, quiet laughter from her room in the evenings. She didn't ask about the old house, and I didn't press. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. Ben started coming over on weekends. At first, just for a night. Then the whole weekend. We made pancakes on Sundays. I let him pick the music while we cooked. He chose classic rock, songs I didn't think he even knew. When I asked him where he heard them, he shrugged and said, "From you years ago." I just remembered. That hit deeper than I let on. Meanwhile, the divorce process moved forward. No surprises. Kelly hadn't contested the filings. She didn't try to block custody. Mitchell said it was rare to see something so clean. He said, "She's either checked out emotionally, or she's trying to minimize damage." I said, "Probably both." The paperwork was close to final. We had one mediation left. Kelly didn't request a lawyer to attend. I took that as a signal. We met in a conference room on the third floor of Mitchell's building. Long table, water pitcher in the middle, cheap chairs. She arrived 2 minutes late. Said hello quietly. I nodded. We sat. She said, "I've looked over everything." I said, "Any changes?" She said, "No. Just wanted to say thank you for not turning this into a fight." I answered, "That wasn't for you. It was for the kids." She looked down, then said, "I know." There was a pause. She said, "You're different now. It's like I can't read you." I said, "That's because I stopped performing." She didn't argue. That evening, I picked up takeout and drove back to the apartment. Emma was on the phone with a friend, pacing the living room barefoot. Ben was playing a game on the tablet. Normalcy. Or something close. I stepped into the small bedroom I used as an office. Looked at the calendar on the wall. March was nearly over. I wrote a note for April 3rd. Final hearing. Later that week, I received a call from an old colleague, Marcus. He said, "Heard about everything. You okay?" I said, "Yeah. It's been a season." He said, "You ever think of starting your own shop? A consulting side thing?" I paused. I said, "You serious?" He said, "You've got the experience. The reputation. And I've got clients who'd listen if you talked." I said, "Let's meet." We met at a diner off Route 114. Talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, I had an outline. Not a business plan, just the first brick. And that was enough. Back at the apartment, I sat at the table and opened my laptop. Created a folder called Foster Energy Consulting. That night I didn't sleep much. Not out of stress, but something closer to ignition. A few days later, Kelly texted. She said, "Can we meet for coffee? Just us?" I waited before answering. Then, "Okay. Tomorrow at 10. Usual place." We met at the same diner from before. She looked tired. Older somehow. She said, "I heard about the business thing. From Ben." I said, "Still early." She said, "I think it's good. You're always better when you build something." I didn't respond. She said, "I don't expect anything. I miss what we were." I said, "So do I. But that version of us is gone." She nodded slowly. She said, "If I had asked you to stay, would you have?" I said, "You didn't." She didn't cry. Just sat still. I stood. I said, "Take care of yourself, Kelly." She whispered, "You too." And that was the last time we met in person. Back home, I stared at the new folder on my laptop. Just a name, just a start. But it felt like a doorway. And I understood, maybe for the first time, survival wasn't the goal. Becoming something new was. And I was already on my way. April 3rd arrived like any other Wednesday. No rain. No wind. Just a crisp Texas morning, 57 degrees by 8 a.m., with a cloudless sky and a kind of silence that settles in just before something changes for good. I put on a dark gray suit. White shirt. No tie. Polished shoes, the same pair I'd worn for my wedding 20 years ago. They still fit. Still held. The courthouse was 20 minutes away. I left early, parked 2 blocks out, and walked. I didn't want valet. I didn't want anyone touching the door for me. That walk, I needed to make it alone. I sat in the hallway outside courtroom 304. One other couple waited across from me, whispering in stiff tones. A clerk moved through with a clipboard. I stayed still. At 9:42, Kelly arrived. No attorney. Just her, in a beige coat and flats. Her hair was pulled back. She didn't meet my eyes. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Everything had already been said. At 10:02, the judge entered and called our names. We stood. He verified our identities. Read from the docket. Asked if there were any objections to the terms filed. He said, "Mrs. Foster, do you object to any portion of this agreement?" She said, "No, Your Honor." He turned to me. He said, "Mr. Foster?" I said, "No objection." The judge nodded, shuffled some papers, then said, "Then it is the decision of this court that the marriage of Daniel and Kelly Foster be dissolved effective immediately, with terms as outlined. Case closed." The gavel struck wood. I looked over at Kelly. She sat down slowly. Her shoulders sagged. No one beside her. No attorney. No friend. The mascara under her eyes had begun to run. She wasn't crying, not really. But the face said everything. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked out. No ceremony. No drama. Just closure. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. The sun was still sharp in the sky. I took the long route back to my car. At a red light near the old post office, I paused and watched people crossing the street. Ordinary people, carrying dry cleaning, cups of coffee, their own silent stories. Back at the apartment, the kids were due in by evening. Emma had a debate team meeting. Ben had soccer. I stopped by the store, picked up ingredients for chicken stir-fry, and thought about what it meant to cook without waiting for anyone's approval. Just making dinner because it felt like a Tuesday. Over the next weeks, the business picked up. Marcus helped land our first small client, a real estate group needing energy audits. I took the meetings, did the analysis, signed the contracts. I moved the folding table out and brought in a proper desk. I updated the bank account. I printed business cards. I was no longer reacting. I was building. Kelly texted once in mid-April. She said, "I heard about the new client." "Congrats." I replied. "Thanks." Nothing else. The kids adjusted. They joked again. Ate more. Slept better. We found rhythm, not perfect but ours. One night Ben asked, "Do you ever think about going back?" I said, "No. I think about going forward." He nodded and went back to his science textbook. On May 2nd, I took a call from a commercial client in Houston. They wanted a site inspection. I packed an overnight bag, left early the next morning, and drove down through Waco, thinking about nothing but the road, the contract, and the quiet inside the car. When I reached the city line, the skyline came into view. I pulled off at a rest stop, grabbed a coffee, and checked the side mirror. No shadows. No second thoughts. Just me. When the judge read the final decision, I glanced over at Kelly. She sat alone. No lawyer. No makeup to hide behind anymore. And I just walked out. No words. No drama. Just the sound of my own shoes on the polished floor, heading toward the rest of my life. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Real men who don't yell. They act. Coldly. All the way.